Since 1970, there's been a 69% decline in wildlife population, including birds, amphibians, reptiles and fish. This is according to the World Wildlife Fund Living Planet report for 2022, released just this week. The study found that freshwater populations have fallen by an average of 83%. This is the largest decline of any species group. In December, world leaders will meet at the Convention of Biological Diversity Conference, where this will indeed be discussed. But before we get to that, let's speak to the WWF South Africa's Land and Biodiversity Stewardship Portfolio Senior Manager, Angus Burns, who joins us virtually from Newcastle in northern KZN. Angus, thank you so much for your time this evening. That figure of 69% surely is going to get you very big headlines because it is such a stunningly big number. But before we get to the gist of what went into it, explain to us this Living Planet Index that was used to calculate these rather shocking numbers.
Thanks very much for inviting us to be here. It is indeed a very alarming report. The Living Planet report is released every 2 years. And what it does is it provides a very clear picture of how species populations are doing and also an indication of ecosystem health. It's been running, as you said, since the 1970s, and it draws on data from close to 32,000 monitored species populations around the globe. And as you mentioned, there's this average decline of 69%. And in Africa, we're talking about 66%. Remember, we're working on averages across the entire globe. So in some countries, some species might be doing better, others might be doing worse. But in Africa, we're looking at a 66% decline since the 1970s.
Let's talk a little bit about Africa before we speak about specific species. And I'm glad you've mentioned that obviously these are average numbers. So there would have been work being done into species that perhaps there was a red flag about some 10 years ago, and those numbers have increased, but only to find out that another species of some kind is now again in peril. It's almost, you know, you think about the little boy putting his fingers in the dam to stop the cracks only for a few more to appear. There just seems to be so much work to be done. But talk to us specifically about, for you, what you think the biggest hotspots and concerns are for biodiversity, specifically in Africa, and with a little bit of focus on South Africa, which I know globally is really lauded for its vast biodiversity.
No, you're absolutely correct. We live in a mega diverse country, and that does offer a degree of resilience in the face of these challenges. But sadly, we are picking up trends that are extremely worrying. I'll give you an example. The West Coast lobster is at 2% of its pre-exploitation populations. If you look at sardines, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the South African Sustainable Seafood Initiative, but what it does is it grades different species of fish according to whether or not they are in the green category or whether they are in the orange or red category. Green meaning you can eat as many as you like, orange meaning you should apply some caution, and red meaning you don't touch them because they're on the brink. And sardines, can you believe this, have moved from the green list to the orange list. That's just devastating. And then you draw a linkage here because all of these things are connected through this web of life that we call ecosystems and the various roles that the different species play in that ecosystem. Penguins, South African penguins, their populations have dropped to only 1% of what they used to be. And their young feed on sardines and anchovies. So can you see the connection? You've got decreasing habitat, you've got decreasing food, and you're getting this collapse that's starting to happen. I just want to mention one quick thing, and that is that it's not all doom and gloom. There are some success stories. So if you look at, for instance, further into Africa, you've got the eastern lowland gorillas that have declined in the Congo, but they've increased in Virunga. So there are some wins. In South Africa, we've got stable populations of black rhino, but we've got diminishing populations of white rhino. So there's a major challenge for us here, and to have a 66% decline on average is very worrying because it will directly affect us as humans.
I'm glad you mentioned the sardine as an example, because I feel like often in South Africa, we hear these stories rather anecdotally. If you're in certain parts of South Africa where the sardine run happens every year, and then you'll hear families that perhaps have been involved in the industry for generations, you'll hear one uncle saying, oh, you know, the sardine run wasn't that good this year. And then you think, okay, next year will be better. And then you keep hearing that story. I mean, I remember being on the West Coast a couple of years ago, and we wanted to purchase some bokkoms. which of course would be very well known there. And locals were quite surprised because we were visiting from Johannesburg. Oh, yeah, there's really not much of a demand, but the pool hasn't been really good for bokkoms for quite some time. And then you wonder if those anecdotal stories from people who are living, eating and breathing our oceans, if it's being paid attention to. And then a report like this comes out and says, actually, there's science here behind it, and a lot of our problems are man-made. Is there a disconnect between those who are living respectively off our land and our seas, and the scientists who are working on it, and then, of course, the role of government, who perhaps, or we know in terms of news, are allowing too much overfishing. And in the end, so many of our species are suffering.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head with what you've just said around particularly food security. It's one of the most important aspects of this because it will affect people very deeply and very, very in a very, very big way across the country. And as you've already said, there's anecdotal evidence. People are noticing that maybe they couldn't catch as many fish as before, and they're struggling to make ends meet maybe for a living because of that. So this is exactly what has been predicted, and it's exactly what scientists are trying to prove, because we can't work with just anecdotal evidence. We have to use real data that can be verified and backed up and proven to be accurate. And this is what this report is showing. You must remember this report works off data from 2018. And people often ask, why is there that 4-year lag before it's released? The reason is very simple. We're a science-based organization, and we have to put all of the data that's gathered through a peer review process to make sure that what we present to you is accurate and defendable. And what you are getting is a report that says there's a call for action. We have to do something now to halt what is clearly an extinction event on a global scale.
Absolutely. Talk to me about this 83% drop in freshwater species population. We're actually flashing that as a fact just across the screen right now. That seems very, very alarming. Talk to us about what the drivers are there. I'm assuming climate change and increasing planet temperature would have a massive issue to do with that as well.
There's a number of factors driving this. First of all, habitat loss and degradation. Many of our river systems are severely polluted. I'm sure you've seen many reports around the country of pollution from municipalities, just absolutely devastating river systems. Combine that with alien invasive plant species that are destabilizing river systems. It's causing siltation in the rivers. It's causing dams to silt up. All of that combined, and also what you're absolutely correct about is climate change, adds up to a very, very difficult situation for the species that live in these river systems and require clean water to survive. Now, you know, before the database was a bit data deficient on the freshwater species. That's since been rectified. So we've got one of the most accurate representations and the widest suite of species that we've ever had in the Living Planet report. And they are well understood species and their populations are well understood. So what's before us now, 83% decline in freshwater species, should make everybody sit up, because even though they're species living in a river, you must remember they're part of that web of life that I spoke about, that ecosystem. And they are part of the solution to keeping our rivers healthy. You don't have a healthy river, you don't have water that you can use. So we rely on these species.
Solid policy is the way to go to get the massive change and quick change that we desperately need.
We absolutely need a commitment of that form on the table from governments around the world. You know, the COP15, the people are calling it the biodiversity conference that's happening in December, is one of those mechanisms that can compel or rather encourage leaders to put various bits of legislation and agreements in place that will then have very, very positive impacts on this particular crisis we're facing. But we must remember that it doesn't end there. Governments can do one thing, they can implement policies that absolutely make a difference, but this is a whole of society approach that's needed. Every single human on this planet relies on this planet for life, for their survival. So it's up to every single one of us to do our bit to turn this tide. And that can be from very basic things, from using less pesticides in your garden, to eating more, you know, in a far more sustainable way, to using less plastic, to not littering, to, you know, maybe even growing your own vegetables in your garden or creating refugia, urban refugia. All these things add up. And if everybody did something like that, combined with political will to implement policy, we could really turn this around. And we have already demonstrated that with some of the species that were on the brink and whose populations are now stable. So I think one mustn't be scared into a state of inertia with a report like this. One must look at it as an opportunity to turn this around and create an enabling situation for the organisms we share this world with and ourselves, because we're reliant on them.
And of course, if not now, then when? Thank you so much for your time this evening. That's WWF South Africa's Land and Biodiversity Stewardship Portfolio Senior Manager Angus Burns joining us virtually there. We'll have more